The first sign that the day would change everything came not with thunder or gunshot, but with the soft creak of a woman's boot slipping on black ice, and the sharp, determined grunt she made when she caught herself before she fell. Emmett Sullivan had been watching her for the better part of 10 minutes from a distance, his breath rising in pale clouds against the bitter Colorado morning. It was November of 1878, and the Rocky Mountains did not care one lick about a person's schedule or their good intentions. The trail that wound up from the small mining town of Caldwell Creek toward the outlying homesteads and the Shoshone encampment beyond the ridge was treacherous under the best conditions. Under a fresh half-inch of ice from the previous night's freezing rain, it was nothing short of murderous, and this woman was attempting it alone, loaded down like a pack mule. He counted 4 bags. 4. One strapped across her back with a crude harness that pulled her shoulders inward, one hanging from each hand, and a 4th she had tucked under her left arm with the grip of someone who had decided she would die before she set it down. The bags were heavy, clearly, because each step she took required a visible moment of renegotiation with her own balance. She planted her foot, steadied, shifted the weight, then stepped again. Plant, steady, shift, step. And she did it with a kind of grim efficiency that told Emmett she had done hard things before, that she was not unfamiliar with being alone in a difficult circumstance. He still could not let her continue. Emmett was 31 years old and had lived in these mountains for the last 9 years, since he'd come west from Tennessee at the age of 22, with nothing but a long rifle, a mule he'd traded 2 months' wages for, and the particular restlessness that had always lived in his chest like a bird that couldn't settle. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from genuine labor rather than vanity, broad through the shoulders and chest, his arms heavy with muscle from years of felling timber, setting trap lines, and hauling everything he needed on his own back. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and it fell past his collar in a way that most men in the towns called unkempt, but that Emmett had simply never cared enough to change. He wore a thick buffalo hide coat that he had cured himself, and his boots were double-soled against the cold. He came down the slope toward her at a steady pace, not rushing, because rushing on ice was a fool's game. She heard him coming and turned her head, and he got his first clear look at her face. She was perhaps 26 or 27. With dark auburn hair that was mostly pinned beneath a practical wool hat that had seen better days. Her eyes, when they found him, were a clear and searching hazel, the kind that seemed to be running calculations even in the midst of physical struggle. Her face was flushed from the cold and from exertion, and there was a cut on her lower lip that was already healing, a few days old at least. She was not what he would call delicate. There was a steadiness in her jaw and a directness in her gaze that communicated she had not been delicate for a long time, if she ever had been. She watched him approach without either retreating or calling out for help. She simply waited, holding her 4 bags with that same iron determination, her breath coming in quick, measured pulls. Emmett reached her, looked at the bags, and without a single word of greeting, preamble, or explanation, took all 4 of them from her. He did it efficiently, unhooking the harness from her back with 2 practiced motions, lifting the 2 from her hands, and taking the 4th from beneath her arm. She was so startled that she let him, her hands coming up empty and her expression shifting from calculation to pure surprise. He redistributed the load across himself, 2 on his back, 1 in each hand, and started back up the trail. After a moment's frozen silence behind him, he heard her boots on the ice following. "You could have at least said good morning," she said. Her voice was clear and carried easily in the cold air. There was a dry note to it that he appreciated, a wryness that said she wasn't genuinely offended, just noting the omission for the record. "Good morning," he said without turning around. A brief pause. "I had those managed, you know." "You had 3 of them managed," he said. "The 4th one under your arm was 30 seconds from the ice." Another pause, longer this time. "How long were you watching me?" "Long enough." He heard what might have been a suppressed laugh, though he could not be entirely sure. They climbed in silence for a stretch, Emmett setting a measured pace that kept them both upright. The trail here was narrow, lined on the uphill side by a gray rock face sheened with ice and on the downhill side by a drop into a ravine dense with spruce. He kept to the middle without thinking about it. "I'm Irene Garrison," she said. "I'm the healer out of Caldwell Creek." He had guessed as much from the bags. He'd caught the smell of dried herbs and the faint medicinal sharpness of tinctures when he'd taken them. "Emmett Sullivan," he said. "I run the trapline up above the old Henderson claim." "I know who you are," she said, and he heard something careful in that, not unfriendly but considered. "People in town talk." He didn't ask what they said. He had a fair idea. He'd lived alone in the mountains long enough that the town of Caldwell Creek had developed opinions about him, the way towns always developed opinions about men who kept their own company. He was aware that those opinions ranged from respectful to wary, with a few running toward outright fear, which he thought was silly but also did not particularly trouble him. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "The Shoshone camp above the ridge," she said. "There's a woman there, Running Deer. She's been ill for 2 weeks. Her husband came into town 3 days ago looking for help. I've been waiting for a break in the weather." She paused. "I suppose this is the break." Emmett looked at the sky, which was the flat gray of a tin bucket and carrying the particular heaviness that meant more weather was coming before nightfall. He did not say this aloud immediately, but he filed it. "What's in the bags?" he asked. "Medicine," she said. "Willow bark yarrow, some compresses, a proper set of surgical tools in case something needs draining, blankets, food. A good healer doesn't show up to a sick patient empty-handed and optimistic." He liked that answer. It was practical in exactly the way he respected practicality, which was to say it was rooted in actual knowledge of how things could go wrong. They reached a section of trail where the ice was particularly bad, a long flat shelf of rock that had collected a half-inch of clear glaze. Emmett slowed and stepped to the side, setting the bags down against the rock face with care. He turned to her. "Step where I step," he said. "Don't hesitate in the middle. One fluid motion, foot to foot." She nodded, no argument, and followed him across the shelf with a steady, careful pace that told him she trusted herself and simply needed a reliable reference point. When they were across, he picked the bags back up without comment and they continued. "You don't need to take those all the way to camp," she said after a while. "Once we're past the icy section is the whole trail until the ridge," he said, "and then the descent on the other side is worse." She was quiet for a moment. "Have you been to the Shoshone camp before?" "Several times," he said. "I winter trade with them, pelts for dried meat and grain. Running Deer's husband is Gray Horse, good man." He heard her let out a breath that was partly relief. "Then you know the way." "I know the way." The silence that followed was comfortable in a way that silences between strangers rarely were. Emmett noticed this. He was not by nature a man who spent a great deal of time analyzing his own interior state, but he was observant enough to notice when something was unusual, and this was unusual. The woman behind him, this Irene Garrison, did not fill silence with chatter the way most people did when they were nervous or uncertain. She simply walked, kept her footing, and seemed content to think her own thoughts while the mountain worked around them. He found himself wondering what those thoughts were. The trail opened out after another 40 minutes onto a broad, south-facing shelf where the worst of the ice had melted in the previous day's thin sunlight, and here Irene pulled even with him rather than walking behind. He glanced at her. Her cheeks were red and bright, and there was a strand of auburn hair that had worked loose from beneath her hat and curled against her temple. "Tell me about Running Deer," he said. "What her husband described." Irene's expression shifted into the focused, serious look that he was beginning to understand was her professional face, the one that replaced the wry steadiness when she was in the work. "Fever that comes and goes, pain in the joints. A cough that started dry and has become wet. She's been sleeping too much, which isn't rest, it's the fever taking her down." "How old is she?" 30, maybe 32. Gray Horse wasn't certain. Emmett nodded. "She had a child last spring," he said. "I was at the camp in March. She just delivered." "The child survived," boy, strong. They named him Hawk Feather. Irene's expression softened briefly, genuinely, and it changed her face in a way that did something unexpected to Emmett's chest. "Then she has very good reason to get well," she said quietly. They were quiet again after that, but it was a different quality of quiet, warmer somehow despite the freezing air. Emmett was aware of her beside him in a way he had not been aware of another person in a very long time. The mountains had suited him precisely because they asked nothing of him socially, nothing of him emotionally, and he had been content with that for 9 years. The solitude had felt clean. It had felt chosen. Standing beside this woman on an icy mountain trail, carrying her bags toward a patient she'd crossed dangerous ground to reach, he felt the solitude differently. Not like a loss exactly. More like the way a room feels just before a lamp is lit, when you've been in the dark so long you've forgotten you were in the dark at all. They reached the ridge just before noon. The wind hit them full force, cutting across the open saddle with a viciousness that made Irene stagger half a step. Emmett moved without thinking, planting himself between her and the worst of the gust, his bulk cutting the wind enough that she caught herself and straightened. "Thank you," she said, loud enough to carry over the wind. He nodded and they pushed across the ridge together, heads down, moving with purpose. On the far side, the trail dropped into a protected valley where the wind died and the spruce grew tall and close, and the first visible sign of the Shoshone camp appeared in the distance, a thread of smoke rising from cook fires, a cluster of hide structures set back against the valley wall. Gray Horse met them at the edge of the camp. He was a man in his late 30s, lean and weathered, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly. When he saw Emmett, something in his shoulders eased. When his gaze moved to Irene, he studied her with the focused attention of a man whose wife was sick, and who needed the person standing before him to be genuinely capable. "This is Irene Garrison," Emmett said in English, and then repeated it in the Shoshone words he knew, a limited but functional vocabulary built over years of trade. "She came up through the ice to help running deer. She knows her work." Gray Horse looked at Irene for a long moment. "You carried all this?" he asked, gesturing to the bags. "I carried some of it," she said simply, and glanced at Emmett with a brief expression that he could not quite read. "He carried the rest." Gray Horse led them to running deer. The woman was lying on a pallet near the central fire of the structure, wrapped in layered blankets, and the moment Irene entered and saw her, she set aside everything else. Emmett watched the transformation with a kind of quiet fascination. The woman who had walked beside him with dry humor and measured composure became, in an instant, someone entirely focused and precise. She knelt beside running deer, spoke softly, checked her pulse, examined her eyes, listened to her chest with an ear pressed gently to her back, and then opened her bags with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. Emmett stayed out of the way. He set the bags where Irene indicated with a gesture, accepted the cup of pine needle tea that one of the older women in the camp pressed into his hands, and watched. He was not a man who watched people usually. He was a man who watched terrain, weather, animal sign. He watched for information that was relevant to survival. He was not sure when Irene Garrison had become relevant to his survival, but the watching felt like the same instinct. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. She made a broth from dried herbs and had running deer drink all of it. She applied compresses to the woman's joints. She prepared a poultice for the chest and administered it with quiet instruction to the women who would continue the care after she left. She explained everything she did in clear, simple terms, and when the older women had questions, she answered them without condescension or impatience. Gray Horse sat in the corner of the structure through all of it, and his face, which had been tight with fear when they arrived, gradually unknotted. When Irene finally sat back and exhaled, running deer was asleep. Not the heavy, feverish sleep of illness, but something quieter and more natural. "She'll need these teas twice a day for 10 days, Irene said to Gray Horse. "And she should eat as much broth as she'll take. The cough is a chest infection, not the consumption. She is strong enough to beat it, but she needs rest and warmth. "You will come back?" Gray Horse asked. "In 5 days," Irene said. "I'll come back to check on her." He nodded once, the kind of nod that was a man's version of relief made visible, and then he said something in Shoshone that Emmett caught partially, a phrase that meant something close to "you carry the healing well." Irene couldn't have understood the words, but she seemed to feel the meaning of it. She pressed her hand briefly over her heart and nodded in return. They left the camp as the afternoon was tilting toward 3 o'clock, which in November at altitude meant the light was already going golden and the temperature was dropping again. Emmett picked up the bags without discussion, lighter now that she had left most of the medicines and supplies with the camp. "You don't have to walk back with me," Irene said, though she did not say it with any real conviction. "The trail is worse coming down than going up," he said, "and it'll be icy again before we reach the bottom." She did not argue. They walked in companionable silence through the valley and back up to the ridge, and when the wind hit them on the saddle again, she was ready for it this time, bracing into it with her head down and her stride deliberate. He watched her from the corner of his eye and felt something settle inside him that he did not have a name for yet. On the downward side of the ridge, as the afternoon shadows stretched long and blue across the ice, she slipped. It was not a dramatic fall, not the kind that would have sent her over the edge, but her right boot went out from under her on a patch of concealed ice, and she went down hard on one knee, catching herself with both hands. The sound she made was sharp and involuntary, the sound of pain not quite suppressed. Emmett was beside her before he had consciously decided to move, setting the bags down and crouching next to her. "Are you hurt?" "My knee," she said through her teeth. "It's fine. I just need a moment." "Let me see." "It's fine. Let me see," he said again, not sharply, but with a steadiness that suggested he was not going to be managed on this point. She looked at him, and something in his expression apparently convinced her that arguing would cost her more time than simply letting him check. She shifted her position, and he carefully examined her knee through her skirt, pressing gently around the joint the way he had learned from years of his own injuries on the mountain, the way you check for genuine damage versus bruising. "Nothing broken," he said. "You'll be stiff tomorrow." "I'm already stiff today," she said, and the dry wryness was back, which he took as a good sign. He helped her to her feet with a hand that she accepted without making it complicated, and then he picked the bags back up and they continued down. But now he kept pace exactly at her shoulder, close enough that when her footing wavered he was there without her having to ask for it, a steady presence at the edge of her balance. She noticed this. He knew she noticed it because once, when she caught herself against a small wobble and his arm was already there, she looked at him sidelong with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and something warmer. They came down off the mountain as the sun touched the western peaks, and the sky turned the color of a bruised peach. Caldwell Creek materialized below them in the valley, its handful of lamplit windows beginning to glow as the day failed. The town was small, barely a proper town in the way that St. Louis was a town, more a collection of determined buildings clustered around the mining operation that had drawn people here in the first place. A main street of packed dirt and weathered wood, a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church, and perhaps 30 houses in various states of completion. At the edge of town, Irene stopped and turned to face him. The remaining bags were between them and she reached for them. "I can take them from here," she said. "Where's your place?" he asked. "The small house behind the church," she said. "The one with the blue door," he nodded. "I'll carry them there." She looked at him for a moment with that calculating, considering expression he was coming to recognize as simply how she looked when she was thinking honestly. "Why?" she asked. "Not that I'm ungrateful, but most men would have handed them back once we were off the mountain." He considered this. He was not a man who explained himself very often, partly because he spent most of his time alone, and there was no one to explain himself to, and partly because he had always found that actions were clearer than words in most circumstances. But she was asking a genuine question, and she deserved a genuine answer. "Because I want to," he said, "and because it's the right thing." She studied him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth lifted in a small, real smile, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it did to his chest what he suspected a July thunderstorm did to a dry meadow. "All right, Emmett Sullivan," she said. "Carry my bags." The house behind the church was modest but not bare. A healer's house, which meant every surface not occupied by something practical was occupied by something medicinal. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the low ceiling. Glass bottles in a dozen colors lined the shelf beside the window. A worktable held a careful array of tools, clean and organized, and the smell of the place was layered and complex, yarrow and pine resin and lavender, and something sharper underneath that he thought might be vinegar. He set the bags on the floor near the door as she lit the lamp on the table. The light pooled warm and yellow in the small room, and she turned in the middle of it and looked at him standing in her doorway, the last light of the evening behind him. "Can I offer you supper?" she asked. "It's the least I can offer after everything." He should have said no. He had a walk back up to his cabin, which was 2 miles above the tree line and not a short journey by lamplight. But the word no did not arrive when he opened his mouth. "I'd like that," he said. Supper was simple, beans and salt pork and hard bread, but she cooked it with efficiency and without apology, and they ate at the small table near the stove with the lamp between them and the wind picking up outside against the windows. They talked. Emmett discovered that Irene Garrison had come to Caldwell Creek from Ohio, where she had trained under a physician uncle for 3 years before that uncle had died of fever, leaving her with his medical kit and an unexpected inventory of practical knowledge. She had come west 2 years ago at the age of 25, following a brief and unsuccessful marriage to a man in Columbus who had, in her words, loved the idea of a capable woman more than he had loved an actual capable woman. She told this with her chin level and her eyes steady, as if she had done the necessary work of arriving at peace with it, and did not require his sympathy, though she would accept his understanding. He told her things he hadn't told anyone in years. About Tennessee, about his father who had been a good man and a hard farmer, and who had died of a broken back when Emmett was 20. About the restlessness that had driven him west. About the years in the mountains that had given him the closest thing to genuine quiet he had ever felt in his life, and about the way that quiet had lately begun to feel different, to feel less like peace and more like absence. He did not say that last part in so many words, but he thought she heard it anyway. She walked him to her door when the hour had grown late, and they stood in the cold dark of the narrow alley behind the church with the stars blazing overhead, the way they only blazed at altitude on a clear night, white and sharp and near. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for the bags and the trail and the walking back." "Thank you for supper," he said. "Are you going back up tonight?" She looked at the sky, reading it the way mountain people learn to read it, with a slight narrowing of the eyes that meant she was calculating. "I'll be fine," he said. "The temperature is dropping fast," she said. "I know these mountains." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I could tell that when we crossed the ridge." A pause. "Will you be back in town soon, before the winter sets in hard?" He thought about that. Under normal circumstances, he came down from the mountain perhaps twice between November and March, once for supplies, and once because the isolation had accumulated past a certain point, and even he required the sight of another human face. But he found, standing here with the lamplight from her window warm against his back, that normal circumstances felt insufficient. "I'll be back in a week," he said, "maybe less." Something moved in her expression, something brief and warm and carefully controlled. "I'll be going up to check on running deer in 5 days," she said. "The trail will be worse." "I'll be here in 5 days," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then that smile came back, the real one, the one that made something in him go very still in the way that the mountains went still just before a storm, when every bird stopped singing at once and the world held its breath. "Good night, Emmett Sullivan," she said. "Good night, Irene." He walked back up the mountain in the dark, the cold pressing in around him, the familiar weight of his solitude settling back onto his shoulders. But it felt different now. It felt like something he was carrying toward a destination rather than something he was standing inside of. He was back in 4 days. He told himself it was because he needed salt from the general store, and because he had a load of pelts ready to trade with Caldwell Creek's buyer. Both of these things were true. They were also both things that could have waited another week without genuine inconvenience. He did not examine this contradiction closely. He came down off the mountain in the early morning of the 4th day, the sky still dark blue at the edges with the last of night, and he went to the general store first because the store was on the main street, and her house was behind the church, and he needed to settle his practical business before he did anything that could be described as deliberate. He was at the counter with his pelts when he heard her voice outside, clear and unhurried, talking to someone. He glanced through the window and saw her standing in the street, talking to an older woman with a bandaged hand, unwrapping the bandage with careful efficiency, while she listened to whatever the woman was telling her. Irene's hair was down today, or mostly down, pinned loosely at the back of her neck, and the morning light caught the auburn in it and made it look almost amber. He finished his business at the store and went outside. She saw him from across the street, and there was a moment, brief but readable, where something lit in her face before she composed it back to neutral. He thought that was the most honest thing he had seen in a long time. "You said a week," she called. "I said maybe less," he called back. The older woman with the bandaged hand looked between them with the sharp-eyed interest of a person who collected information for its own sake. Emmett nodded politely to her. "Ruth," Irene said without taking her eyes off Emmett, "let me just finish wrapping this, and then I need to speak with Mr. Sullivan about the trail." "Of course you do," Ruth said, with a tone that communicated she found this entirely transparent and was not troubled by it. They spoke for over an hour. It began as practical conversation about the trail conditions and the return trip to Running Deer, which was a genuinely necessary discussion, but it drifted naturally into other territories. He told her about a section of trail he knew that avoided the worst of the iced-over rock shelf by swinging south through a stand of old-growth timber. She told him more about Running Deer, about what she expected to find when they returned, about her concerns regarding the infection's progress. Then she asked him about the trapping, and he found himself explaining the work in more detail than he usually bothered to, describing the way you read the snow for animal sign, the way you set a line so that it was efficient rather than cruel, the way the mountain in winter was a different country from the mountain in summer, quieter and starker and more honest. She listened the way good listeners listened, not waiting for her turn to speak but actually following the words, her eyes on him, occasionally asking questions that showed she had been paying attention. He caught himself watching her mouth when she talked. He stopped doing this with some effort. "I want to go up tomorrow morning," she said, when they had covered everything that strictly needed covering and were simply talking because neither of them was ready to stop. "First light. The weather window should hold another 2 days. I'll meet you at the edge of town," he said. "Bring fewer bags this time." "I'll bring exactly what's necessary," she said, with a look that made it clear she had done her own assessment of necessity, and it did not require his input. "Right," he said. "Though," she added, and something shifted in her expression to something slightly more unguarded, "I won't argue if you want to carry them anyway." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the thing that was building between them was not subtle anymore. It had not been subtle since the moment on the icy trail 4 days ago, but it was also neither of them's nature to rush at something this significant. He had a sense that she was a woman who had been hurt by moving too quickly, by trusting the surface of a thing before she understood its depth. And he was a man who had spent 9 years not trusting his own desires enough to test them against reality. "I'll carry them," he said. She smiled and turned away to walk back toward the church, and he stood in the street and watched her go and thought that the mountain, for all its considerable virtues, had nothing on the walk of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and had stopped apologizing for it. The second trip up the mountain was different from the first in almost every way except the ice. There was still plenty of ice. The nights had not warmed above 20 degrees since the first freeze, and the trail was treacherous in all the same places. But this time, they moved together with a kind of easy synchronization that came from having done it once already, from knowing each other's pace and tendencies. She knew now that he walked slightly ahead on the worst sections to test the footing, and she fell in naturally behind him without having to be asked. He knew now that she stopped briefly at the ridge to catch her breath, not from weakness but from the altitude, and he stopped with her without making it a thing. They talked as they climbed. She asked him about the animals he'd seen that season, and he described the wolf pack that had moved into the valley above his cabin, 8 of them, and she asked about them with the focused curiosity of someone who had never been afraid of wildness, who found it interesting rather than threatening. He asked her about the worst case she had treated since coming to Caldwell Creek, and she told him about a mining accident in the spring of her first year, a man brought to her with a timber having fallen across his leg, the bone broken in 3 places. "Did he keep the leg?" Emmett asked. "He kept the leg," she said, with quiet satisfaction. "He walks with a limp now, but he walks." He looked at her. "You're good at this," he said. "I know," she said simply, without false modesty and without arrogance, the way a person says something true. Running deer was better. The difference was visible the moment they entered the structure. She was sitting up, her color improved, and when she saw Irene she managed a genuine smile, the effortful, significant kind that sick people produce when they are beginning to surface from illness. Irene examined her with the same thorough precision as the first time, and her face through the examination was professional and controlled. But when she sat back and told Gray Horse that the infection was retreating and that his wife would be well before the month was out, something bright moved through her expression. Gray Horse said, in Shoshone, that the healer had the hands of someone who had been taught by good medicine. Emmett translated this. Irene ducked her head briefly, and the back of her neck went pink in a way he found entirely distracting. They stayed for 2 hours, and when they left the camp, Gray Horse walked them to the edge of the valley and presented Emmett with a cured deer hide of extraordinary quality as thanks, and Irene with a beaded medicine bag, small and meticulously crafted, the kind of thing that took patience and skill and was not given lightly. Irene held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. "Tell him it's the most beautiful thing anyone has given me in a long time," she said quietly. Emmett translated. Gray Horse nodded once, with the dignity of a man who had given exactly the right thing. On the way back down the mountain, in the protected stretch of old-growth timber where the trail swung south and the light came through the spruce in long cathedral columns, she reached for his hand. She did it without announcement or preamble, simply reached sideways and her fingers found his, and he stopped walking. They stood in the timber with the cold pressing in softly around them, and he looked down at her hand in his, and then at her face. "Is this all right?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something complicated, something that understood the weight of the question. "Yes," he said. The word came out rougher than he intended, stripped of decoration by the force of meaning it. They stood like that for a moment, hand in hand in the winter timber, and then she let out a slow breath that misted in the cold air, and he felt her fingers press gently against his. He squeezed back, once, careful with the strength he knew he had, and she looked up at him with an expression that made everything simple. They walked the rest of the way down the mountain hand in hand. The complications began 2 weeks later, as complications in a mountain town always did, with other people's opinions arriving before anyone had been asked for them. The man's name was Gerald Holt, and he was the owner of the only saloon in Caldwell Creek, a man in his mid-40s who had decided in the first month of Irene's arrival in town that she would make him a suitable wife, and had been conducting a slow, proprietary campaign toward this end ever since. He had never been outright or honest about it, which Irene found more exhausting than direct pursuit would have been. He brought her things she hadn't asked for. He offered her opinions on her work that she hadn't requested. He had a way of standing close to her in a crowd that communicated ownership without any of the actual relationship that ownership required. Emmett learned all of this the morning he came into town and found Gerald Holt standing outside Irene's door. He could tell from 20 yards away that the conversation was not welcome. Irene's posture communicated it, that particular stillness she used when she was managing her own response to something, when she was choosing patience over her first instinct. Holt was talking and Irene was listening and not agreeing, and Holt had that look that men who mistake courtesy for affection sometimes get, the look of a person interpreting silence as invitation. Emmett came up the alley without hurrying. Holt saw him first, and his expression went through several interesting phases: surprise, calculation, and then a studied pleasantness that was the social mask of a man who understood he was at a disadvantage and intended to make that disadvantage invisible. "Sullivan," he said, "didn't know you were in town." "I'm in town," Emmett said. He looked at Irene. "Mr. Holt was just leaving," she said. Holt's jaw tightened briefly. "Just checking in on Miss Garrison. She had a difficult walk yesterday." He had not been there for any difficult walk, a detail so obvious that pointing it out felt unnecessary. He looked at Emmett with an assessment that was meant to be subtle and was not. "Heard you've been accompanying her up to the Indian camp." "I have," Emmett said. "Mountain's a dangerous place for a woman alone," Holt said, and then to Irene, in the particular tone of someone who thinks they are being protective and is actually being diminishing. "I've said before I could arrange for one of my boys to go with you. Reliable men." "I'm reliably accompanied," Irene said. Her voice was level and perfectly civil, and had the quality of a door being firmly and politely closed. "Good day, Gerald." Holt looked between them one more time, made the calculation that the ground here was not favorable, and left with the kind of measured dignity that meant he was very angry and determined not to show it. The moment he was gone, Irene let out a breath and turned to Emmett with an expression that mixed relief with the particular frustration of a woman who has been managing this situation for longer than is reasonable. "That happens often?" he asked. "Regularly," she said. "He's never done anything overtly wrong. He's just been consistently present in a way that I haven't wanted." Emmett looked down the alley after Holt's retreating figure. "I could speak with him," he offered. "No," she said immediately, firmly. "I fight my own battles, Emmett. I'm capable of handling Gerald Holt." A pause. "I just prefer not to have to handle him alone, is all." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with that clear, direct hazel gaze, and the meaning beneath the words was not hidden. She was not a woman who hid meanings when she had decided something. She was not saying she needed him to fight for her. She was saying she wanted him beside her. There was a difference, and it was a difference he understood precisely. "Then I'll be here," he said. She nodded once decisively and then said, "Come inside. I made coffee this morning and there's still some in the pot." November deepened toward December, and Emmett found himself spending more time down the mountain than he had in any of the 9 years previous. He had established a rhythm of 3 or 4 days in town, followed by 2 or 3 up at the cabin tending his traps, and this rhythm suited both his practical needs and the slowly solidifying thing happening between him and Irene. He fixed the hinge on her back door, which had been sticking so badly that she'd been leaving it propped open to the cold. He came with her on her rounds to the homesteads east of town, 3 families spread across the valley floor who relied on her when illness or injury arrived. He watched her work and understood that he had rarely in his life been in the presence of genuine vocation, the kind of calling that a person carries not as a burden but as a purpose, the thing that makes them most fully themselves. She was most fully herself with her medical kit open and another person's need before her. He was moved by this in ways he could not immediately articulate, but he understood it instinctively because he recognized it as a kind of honesty, the specific honesty of doing the work you were made for without performing or apologizing for it. She watched him too. He knew she watched him the way he watched her, with a tension that was trying to understand rather than simply approve. She asked him about his childhood, about Tennessee, about the years that had shaped him before the mountains. He answered her as honestly as he knew how, which for him required effort because honesty about the interior life was a skill he had let go unpracticed. But he found that, with her, the words came more naturally than he expected. The evening that changed things properly came in the second week of December, when a cold front had settled over the valley, and the temperature was sitting at 10 degrees above zero, and the town of Caldwell Creek had drawn itself inward against the cold. He had come down that afternoon with a load of pelts and had helped Irene administer to the Miller boy, 7 years old, who had gotten into some bad berries and spent 2 days miserable before his mother had brought him in. Irene had him sorted in an hour, and the boy's recovery was swift enough that, by the time Emmett left, they were watching him eat half a pie at his mother's kitchen table. They walked back toward Irene's house in the dark, the snow packing underfoot, the cold absolute and clear. The stars were out again, the same blazing, altitude-sharpened stars he had seen on that first night months ago, and she was beside him close enough that their arms brushed with each step. At her door she turned to him, and there was something different in her face tonight, something that had been building for weeks and had finally arrived at the surface, patient and inevitable as snow. "Emmett," she said. "Irene," he said, and then he kissed her. It was not impulsive. Nothing that had been building this long could be described as impulsive, but it arrived suddenly enough that she made a small, surprised sound against his mouth before she kissed him back, her hands coming up to his chest and gripping the front of his buffalo coat. He kept the kiss gentle because she was worth gentleness, because every careful, watchful, honest thing about her deserved to be met with care. But it was not tentative. 9 years of mountain solitude, and the specific particular longing that this woman had woken in him, made it not tentative. When they broke apart, she kept her hands in his coat and pressed her forehead against his chest and said nothing for a moment. He put one large hand against her back, warm and steady, and waited. "I didn't think I wanted this," she said quietly. "Another thing, another person." "I know," he said. "I'm not sorry that I was wrong," she said, and tilted her head back to look up at him in the dark. He kissed her forehead and then her temple and then her mouth again, soft and certain. "Neither am I," he said. The winter deepened around them after that, and they deepened with it. He moved most of what he needed down to the cabin she kept behind the church by January, and no one in Caldwell Creek missed what this meant, nor did either of them make any secret of it. Ruth, the older woman whose bandaged hand Irene had been wrapping that first day, stopped Emmett on the street one morning in December and told him firmly that Irene Garrison was worth more than gold, and that he should not be an idiot about it. He agreed with both assessments. Gerald Holt became quieter after December, his proprietary attentions redirected elsewhere in the manner of a man who understood when a situation had been definitively resolved. And while Emmett did not go out of his way to be unkind to him, neither did he go out of his way to give him any remaining ambiguity to work with. Emmett was not a man who did things by halves. Once he had decided on something, he decided on it fully, and he had decided on Irene Garrison with the same totality with which he had decided on the mountains. He told her this on a January evening when the snow was coming down outside her window in great soft curtains, and she was sitting at her worktable labeling medicine bottles, and he was mending a piece of harness leather by the stove. She set down her pen and looked at him. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, in the tone that meant she knew exactly what he was saying and wanted him to say it plainly. "I'm saying I intend to keep you," he said. A pause. "Keep me?" she repeated, and there was enough in her tone that he reconsidered the phrasing. "Stay beside you," he amended, "for good, if that's what you want too." She looked at him for a long time, her hazel eyes working through something complex, and then she set the medicine bottle down and came across the small room and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a directness and warmth that left him in no doubt about her answer. "Yes," she said, against his mouth. "That's what I want." They were married in February, which was not traditionally a sensible time to have a wedding in the Colorado Rockies. But Irene pointed out that the mining industry slowed in winter and people had more time to attend. And Emmett pointed out that waiting seemed unnecessary, and neither of them was wrong. The ceremony was in the small church, presided over by the reverend who had been in Caldwell Creek for 6 years, and who had seen enough of the frontier to know that love in the Wild West did not always announce itself with flowers and perfect weather. Sometimes it announced itself with ice on the trail, and a man who picked up all your bags without a word. Every person in Caldwell Creek who was ambulatory in winter attended, which amounted to about 40 people, which was most of the town. Running Deer and Gray Horse came down from the mountain for it, which touched Irene so genuinely that she pressed her hand to her mouth when she saw them arrive. Running Deer was entirely recovered, the chest infection completely gone, and she was carrying hawk feather on her back in a beautifully beaded carrier. And when she came to Irene before the ceremony and placed a wreath of dried mountain flowers on her hair, there was no adequate English word for what passed between them. Ruth cried through the entire ceremony and did not apologize for it. Emmett stood at the front of the church in the best clothes he owned, which he had gotten in a trade at the general store that morning, a dark wool coat that fit his broad shoulders, and a white shirt that had been ironed by Mrs. Miller at the boarding house because she had insisted, and he watched Irene walk toward him and felt the specific brand of stillness that had been building in him since an icy November morning when he'd seen a woman with too many bags and a stubborn spine, and eyes that saw everything. She was wearing a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the course of December and January, and her hair was loose beneath the dried flower wreath, and she was looking at him with those clear hazel eyes, and the expression that he had come to understand was what her face looked like when she was wholly herself, not professional or managed or careful, just Irene. He had not said anything poetic to her that morning. He had said, standing in the snow outside the church door, "You look like everything I should have been looking for all along." She had laughed, and then she had gone inside and come back out carrying a single dried larkspur she'd pressed in the fall, and she'd tucked it into his buttonhole and said, "Now we match." He thought about that in the church while she walked toward him. He thought that he had spent 9 years building a life in the mountains that was complete in the way a stone wall is complete, every necessity accounted for, nothing wasted, entirely functional and entirely closed. And he thought that she had, on an icy trail on a gray November morning, simply walked through it, carrying too many bags and not asking for help, and being exactly too much herself for him to walk away from. The Reverend read the words and they said what they meant, and when he was told he could kiss his bride he did so with the full and unself-conscious warmth of a man who had finally found the thing he'd been restless for. The town erupted into cheers. Ruth produced a pie from somewhere. It was not clear how she had gotten it there. Spring came to Caldwell Creek the way it always came to the high country, grudgingly and then all at once, the snowpack retreating first from the south-facing slopes, then from the valley floors, then slowly from the trail up to the ridge. By April the trail to the Shoshone camp was clear enough for regular travel, and Irene went up twice a month to see Running Deer, who had become, in the way that deep things happen between people who have seen each other at the bottom of need and the top of recovery, one of her closest friends. Emmett went with her every time. He carried the bags still, though she had reorganized them down to a single practical pack after the wedding, and she had accepted this carrying not as a statement of her need, but as a statement of his love, which was what it was. He had found other things to carry for her too, over the months of their marriage. He carried the difficulty of her work when it was heavy, the grief she felt when a patient was lost, the frustration of the town's occasional tendency to be suspicious of a woman who knew things they didn't. He carried these things not by taking them from her, but by standing with her inside them, which she had taught him was the difference. She carried things for him too. The nightmares, which he hadn't told anyone about in years, the ones that came from the mountains themselves, from a winter 7 years back when he'd been snowed in for 3 weeks, and the line between solitude and desolation had gone invisible. She carried them without fuss or alarm, with a practical warmth that was her way of saying, "I am here and I am not going anywhere." That summer, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on the blue-sky morning of a June day when the meadow above town was full of wildflowers, and she had just returned from a ride out to the Miller homestead. She came in the door and he knew from the way she was carrying herself, a particular interior brightness that was different from her usual, that something had shifted. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned from the work table where he was carving a new tool handle and looked at her. "We're expecting," she said, and her voice was steady and her eyes were soft. He set the tool handle down very carefully, which was a thing you did when your hands were suddenly not reliable, and he came to her and put both arms around her and held her against his chest for a long moment without speaking. Her arms went around him and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and he felt her exhale with the deep relief of someone who has been holding something important and has finally been able to put it down into safe hands. "Are you happy?" she asked, muffled against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. He said it without qualification or delay because it was exactly and only true. "It'll change things," she said. "Good," he said. She laughed at that, a real and full laugh, and pulled back to look at his face, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy the last of her uncertainty, because she kissed him with her whole attention and he kissed her back in kind. The child was a boy born in February of 1880, delivered by Irene herself with the practical assistance of old Ruth, who turned out to have a steady hand and a calm that came from having brought 6 children into the world of her own. Emmett was not far away, just outside the door in the cold, wearing a path in the snow with the pacing that was apparently unavoidable no matter how calm a man believed himself to be. When Ruth opened the door and said, "A boy, Emmett. Come meet your son," he went inside, and the small, red-faced creature in Irene's arms looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newly born, and Emmett Sullivan, who had faced mountain weather and wolf packs and 9 years of solitude without displaying what anyone would have called excessive emotion, had to sit down on the edge of the bed and take a moment. Irene put the boy in his arms. He held his son with the careful, controlled strength of a man aware of what he was holding, and the baby made a sound that was not quite protest and not quite contentment but somewhere in between, and Emmett looked at Irene and found her already watching him with everything she felt visible in her face. "What do we call him?" she asked. He had thought about this. "Daniel," he said, "after my father." Her eyes filled briefly and then she nodded. "Daniel," she said, testing the weight of it. "Daniel Sullivan, Daniel Sullivan," he agreed. Ruth, from the corner, said that she thought it was a fine name, and that both of them should sleep before they made any more important decisions, and the general wisdom of this was undeniable. The years that followed in Caldwell Creek were good years, the kind that a person looks back on later and understands as the years when the life they had been building finally came to look like what it was supposed to be. Emmett went back up to his cabin above the tree line each winter for the trapping, though he was rarely gone more than 3 or 4 days at a stretch, because Daniel was young, and because the cabin above town where he and Irene had made their actual home was a fine place to be. He had built onto it in the summers of 1879 and 1880, adding 2 rooms and a proper kitchen, because Irene needed a workspace that was separate from the living space, and because a child required space. The building had been a genuine pleasure, the first time in his life he had built something for the specific purpose of housing people he loved, and the difference between that and building for pure function was something he felt in his hands each time he set a board. Irene's practice grew. By 1881, she was treating not only Caldwell Creek, but 3 surrounding mining settlements, traveling out with her pack and her horse twice a month. She trained a young woman named Clara, 16 years old, the daughter of the miller, who had shown an aptitude for the work and a genuine desire to learn, And watching Irene teach was like watching her most essential quality made visible: the patience and the precision and the deep respect for the person being helped. Gerald Holt eventually married a woman named Margaret from Denver, who had come out on the stage in the spring of 1880, and they seemed well suited to each other, and whatever remained of his earlier fixation on Irene appeared to have concluded with his marriage. He nodded to Emmett on the street in a way that was civil and genuine, the nod of a man who had moved past an old discomfort, and Emmett nodded back in the same spirit. The frontier was small and required that people find ways to coexist, and both men were practical enough to understand this. Running Deer and Gray Horse's son, Hawk Feather, grew into a bright and endlessly curious child who, on the occasions when Running Deer and Gray Horse came down to Caldwell Creek, or when Irene and Emmett went up to the Shoshone camp, treated Daniel Sullivan as an instant and obvious companion with the straightforward logic of children who have not yet learned the adult variety of suspicion. The two boys ran together through the camp or through the meadow above town with equal comfort, and both Irene and Running Deer watched them go with the expression of mothers who understand that the future is being made right now in the grass. In 1882, Irene told Emmett they were expecting again. This time he did not need to sit down, though the feeling was exactly as large as the first time. He simply held her in the kitchen of their home, with the evening coming in through the windows and Daniel making noise in the other room with whatever collection of items he had found to occupy himself. And he said thank you against her hair. And she said, "What are you thanking me for?" And he said, "Everything." And she laughed and pressed her hand flat against his chest the way she had from the very beginning, as if she was checking to make sure his heart was still there. The second child was a girl, born in the winter of 1883, with auburn hair like her mother and her father's dark eyes, a combination that old Ruth declared was the most unfair deployment of good looks she had witnessed in her considerable years. They named her Clara Me, with the me for the month she was born, and Emmett held her with the same careful, overwhelming tenderness he had held Daniel, and the baby opened her dark eyes and looked up at him, and he was, again, entirely undone. Daniel, age 3, approached his new sister with the considered expression of a judge reviewing evidence, poked her carefully once on the cheek, and announced that she was all right. This was considered a fine review. The town of Caldwell Creek grew through the 1880s as mining operations expanded and more families came west. The territory moved toward statehood, which arrived for Colorado in 1876, and the changes that came with it were sometimes good and sometimes complicated. The Shoshone faced increasing pressure from land interests as the decade progressed, and Emmett found himself in more than one difficult conversation in Caldwell Creek's saloon about the treatment of the people he had traded and lived alongside for years. He was not a man who delivered speeches, but he was a man who knew how to make himself clear, and he made himself clear on this subject in a way that left no confusion about where he stood. Irene wrote letters. She wrote to the territorial government, and then to the state government, and to anyone she thought might have ears for it, careful, precise, specific letters that documented the situation with the thoroughness of someone trained to observe and record. She did not always receive answers. She kept writing. Running Deer knew about the letters, and once, when they were sitting together in the camp on a late summer afternoon while the children played in the grass nearby, Running Deer had said that Irene fought in the way of someone who understood that some fights took longer than a lifetime. Irene had held that thought for a long time and then said, "Then we pass it to the ones who come after us." Running Deer had agreed. By 1885, Emmett Sullivan was 38 years old, and if you asked anyone in Caldwell Creek about him, they would describe a man who was still very large, still broad and powerfully built, still wore his hair somewhat longer than fashion strictly required, and who carried himself with the settled certainty of a man who had found the exact place he was supposed to be. The restlessness that had driven him west from Tennessee at 22 had been gone for a long time now, so long that he could barely recall what it had felt like, only that it had been the thing that brought him to the right mountain at the right time to find a woman on an icy trail with too many bags and an absolute refusal to admit she needed help. Irene was 33 and had stopped apologizing for anything years ago, though she had never really started. She had patients who came from 30 miles away. She had trained Clara thoroughly enough that the younger woman was now making independent rounds to the eastern homesteads. She had a home that smelled like medicine and bread and pine, with 2 children who were opinionated and curious and generally excellent, and a husband who had never once in all their years together made her feel that her work was less important than his, or her needs less significant than the demands of the mountain. One November evening in 1885, almost exactly 7 years after the morning on the icy trail, Emmett came in from outside carrying an armload of split wood and found Irene sitting at her work table with Daniel asleep against her shoulder and Clara me on her lap, both children overcome by the evening in the way of children who fight sleep until the moment they don't. She was still working with her free hand, making notes in the careful script she used for her medical records, and she looked up when he came in and the lamp caught the auburn in her hair, and the expression on her face was so completely itself, so entirely Irene, that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment. "You're letting in the cold," she said quietly, with the particular exasperated fondness of a wife who has said this many times. He came in and closed the door and set the wood down by the stove and stood there looking at his family, the whole of what the restlessness had been looking for all along, in this small bright room in the high country of Colorado. "What?" she said, looking at him with the smile that still did the same thing to him it had always done, from that first smile on the edge of Caldwell Creek with her empty hands and her surprised expression. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She tilted her head in the way that meant she understood exactly what he meant and did not require further explanation. He came and lifted Clara me gently from her lap, the child making a soft sound of protest before resettling against his shoulder, and sat down beside Irene at the table with his daughter in his arms and his son asleep against his wife's shoulder, and the stove crackling warm against the Colorado night. "Gray Horse sent word," he said. "The wolf pack has come back to the valley, 14 of them this time." 14, she said, with the pleased wonder that natural things still drew from her. "That's a good number." "It's a very good number," he said. She reached over and took his free hand where it rested on the table, her fingers settling between his with the ease of years, and they sat together in the quiet of the evening, and the children breathed and the stove spoke, and outside the window the mountain stood in the dark the way they always stood, immense and indifferent to anything except their own existence. But inside this room was not indifference. Inside this room was everything that indifference was not. It was specificity, the specific warmth of these 2 people, the specific weight of these 2 children, the specific history of an icy trail and 4 bags, and a man who had not said a single word when he took them, who had simply understood that some things you did because they were right, and because you were capable of doing them, and because the woman who needed them done was worth every step of every difficult mountain you would ever climb. Irene had told him once, in the way she sometimes told him things, sideways and certain at the same time, that she had spent a long time believing that needing help was the same as being weak, and that the morning on the icy trail he had shown her something different. He hadn't asked for thanks, hadn't made it a transaction, hadn't said anything at all. He had just picked up the weight and walked. She had said it was the first time she'd understood that some people carried because they wanted to, because carrying something alongside you is one way of saying you matter, you are worth the weight of this, I will go wherever you are going. He had not known how to respond to this at the time, because it had been so completely true, and because hearing her say it had done something large and irreversible to his interior landscape. He thought about it tonight, sitting beside her with Clara me warm and heavy against his shoulder. He thought about the icy trail and the gray sky, and the moment her boots had crunched behind him as she followed, not because she'd had to, but because she'd decided to trust the man who had taken her bags without a word and started walking toward where she needed to go. Outside, the Colorado winter was settling into the mountains with its full gravity, the temperature dropping, the stars blazing, the wolf pack running in the valley above with 14 of them now, more than enough to be a real presence in the landscape. Emmett Sullivan put his lips to his daughter's hair and looked at his wife in the lamplight, and thought that 9 years in the mountains had given him something real and true, and that this woman and this life had given him something that could not be named at all, only lived, only carried, only offered again each morning when you woke to the person who had chosen you back. Irene looked up and found him watching, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, careful not to disturb Daniel, and closed her eyes for just a moment in the warmth of it. He pressed his mouth to her temple. "Good night," he said, the way he had said it on the very first night at her door in the cold dark, before either of them had known what all of this would become. She smiled without opening her eyes. "Good night, Emmett Sullivan," she said. And outside, the mountains held them both, as they always had, vast and cold and permanent. But inside the room with the blue door and the lamp burning warm, everything that mattered was entirely, perfectly present. And the story that had begun on an icy trail with a mountain man and a woman with too many bags was not ending so much as simply settling into what it had always been becoming, a thing as solid as the mountains themselves, and considerably warmer.